Hello, I'm Doug Muzzio. This is CityTalk. It was born in crisis 46 years ago and has been in a few since. It is the largest urban mass transit system in the hemisphere, and it is imbalanced. It's the Metropolitan Transportation Authority, and joining me in the second of occasional conversations on the problems and prospects of New York State is Richard Ravitch. Mr. Ravitch has a distinguished history of public service. He most recently co-chaired the State Budget Crisis Task Force along with former Fed Chairman Paul Volcker. He rescued the Urban Development Corporation in the 1970s, is widely credited with saving the MTA as chairman from 1979 to 1983. He also chaired the 1988-89 New York City Charter Revision Commission. He served as Major League Baseball's labor negotiator, and in July 2009, he was sworn in as Lieutenant Governor of New York. This April, he's publishing a memoir/policy discussion titled So Much to Do, A Full Life of Business, Politics, and Confronting Fiscal Crises. He's New York State government's Mr. Fix-It. Welcome back, Mr. Ravitch.
Always a pleasure to be here.
Okay, so this past January, we talked about the State Task Force final report and its report on New York State, and we touched on some of the challenges that we'll discuss today and in the future. So what did I do? I went back to 2008, December 2nd, 2008, when there's a report released from the Commission on Metropolitan Transportation Authority Financing, chaired by one Richard Ravitch. Deja vu all over again. Back to the future. Describe the state of transit then, and is it different now, the problems confronting the agency?
In one sense, the problems are the same. There are never enough resources to provide the level of service that one would like to provide, or to maintain the level of investment necessary to both maintain a state of good repair on the existing system, plus expanding the system given the population growth that's taking place in the metropolitan area. So there is always a need in excess of the available means. The question is to what extent that gap exists, and to what extent the political system and the board of the MTA, an independent public authority, are prepared to exercise the powers they have to close that gap.
Okay. Before we get to those powers, let's just lay out what the MTA is. What does it include infrastructure-wise? What is the MTA?
It includes the New York City subway system, both the IRT and the independent subway systems.
Oh, and the BMT, you're using old talk here.
Well, you have to know a little history to understand
Right.
the present. Includes all the bus systems in New York, all of which were privately owned at one point,
Yep.
as indeed were the subway systems. Except the government would never, in its regulatory capacity, let the private owners charge enough fares to enable them to break even.
And then the city took them over, I guess, in
Correct.
the early 1940s.
Yes.
Along with the IND, merged the three. Okay.
That's correct.
Okay, so we've got New York City
and then
Transit.
the Long Island Railroad went broke, and the state took that over, because you had 100,000 commuters. And then the Central went broke, the Harlem and Hudson went broke, and the state took those over. So the MTA owned the roadbeds under the three Westchester commutation lines, but it was operated by Conrail, which the federal government had set up as a nonprofit entity to run the railroads that had all gone broke. The freight railroads had gone broke also. And the MTA also, the board of the MTA was also the board of the Triborough Bridge and Tunnel Authority.
So that's the Triborough / RFK, Throgs Neck, Whitestone, Marine Park Bridge. I mean, that's all the bridges.
Yes.
Gil Hodges, Cross Bay, all those bridges.
All those bridges. The only bridges it didn't cover are the ones the Port Authority covers too.
Right, and the two tunnels, the Brooklyn Battery and the Queens
And
Midtown.
that's correct.
So, okay, what is the governing structure? It's created in '68. What's the governing structure? You know, who's got
There's a board.
the power?
There's a board.
Go ahead.
The governor appoints, if I remember correctly, 5 or 6 members of the board. The mayor appoints 4, and the counties surrounding New York City that are covered by the commuter railroads each appoint 1.
Right, so you have, what is it, Nassau, Suffolk, and Westchester have 1, and then there's 4 other
Rockland,
counties
yes,
that have it. I guess it's
split one.
right, Rockland, Dutchess,
Yeah, they're called
Orange, and
quarterlies.
Putnam. Okay, now, let's start looking at numbers here. And part of my intro said that it's imbalanced. It's got this, as you discussed it, this structural imbalance. And if you look at the financial plan, the current financial plan, there are a lot of problems with it. Describe the nature of MTA finances generally and the 2014-15 financial plan.
I'm not an insider.
No, I get it.
And therefore, I don't know the precise number.
Right, no.
What I know is that that the sources of revenue, i.e. the fares,
Right.
the tolls, and the taxes enacted in Albany for the purpose of providing subsidy for the MTA, have not gone up as fast as their costs have gone up, in part because of economic events in 2008. But there is a significant recovery taking place now because of some of the transactional taxes that provide revenue to the
Sure.
MTA.
Including, I guess, real estate.
And they concluded that they did not need a fare increase in the current year.
Was that wise not to have a fare increase and not use whatever funds would be generated in terms of capital or debt service?
I think the problem is going to arise when they confront the necessity of the next 5-year capital plan.
Right.
Because they are deficient by, I think, I've heard at least close to $20 billion. No available source of revenue to finance $20 billion of capital investment for the next plan, and they have a very significant overrun in the costs of the
East Side Access, and then the Fulton Street terminal.
That is correct.
Nexus. Now, so you've got $20 billion. It's unfunded, and how does that's only to keep the system operating. That's not, as you suggested earlier, paying for things like what, the Second Avenue subway, the extension of the 7th line.
Well, the East Side Access is a new system.
Right.
And, that was put in because there was heavily advocated by Al Donato, who was a very critical person on the Senate Appropriations Committee at that time. And the theory was that a lot of Long Island commuters wanted to get to the east side of Manhattan instead of to Penn Station. Some people believed, as I did at the time, been a hell of a lot less expensive to extend the 7 line from Grand Central to Penn Station. Instead, they, for totally different reasons, they extended the 7 line to the Jet Stadium.
Right, and then
not to Penn Station.
Right.
So,
so we have a series of perhaps policy mistakes going on.
that is a felicitous way of putting it.
Thank you. Where do you find the money? How do you fund this $20 billion, $26 billion capital plan without some blood, sweat, and tears and some guts?
I am, first of all, the MTA board is going to, and its chairman, who's a very able guy. I've known Tom for 25 years. He's a transportation expert, an honorable human being.
And yes, that came with real cachet.
And he and his colleagues are going to have to devise a plan, and they're going to have to bring it to the governor, and the governor and the legislature are going to have to consider what they're prepared to do to provide the means.
And what elements might this plan have financially? I mean, you've looked at it
New revenues,
specifically.
tolling the East River Bridge.
Now, that was you proposed this in 2008. It's been proposed since. Sam Schwartz was on this show proposing it again. It is. I mean, there's a political reality that you're fully cognizant of. It ain't gonna happen.
Well, Doug, let me tell you something.
Okay, talk to me.
They told me in 1980 that I'd never get a law passed giving the MTA the power to borrow money. And then Wall Street told me I'd never sell bonds backed by subway fares. Both happened.
So the impossible is possible in politics.
It's not impossible. It's
What
a
would you
question
Go ahead.
of balancing political interests. People who represent Brooklyn and Queens are very unhappy about the prospect of having to pay to use what is currently free bridges.
But in fact, as Schwartz argues, you can have a more equitable system and a system that generates more revenue that can be placed at the disposal of the authority to enhance the transportation
Look, I
system.
actually proposed this back in the early 80s when I was chairman, and I got laughed out of existence at the time. I proposed it in 2008 when I chaired the commission that you referred to, and actually, believe it or not, the leadership of the assembly was quite willing to enact legislation to accomplish that.
Wow.
And it was blocked in the Senate by 3 Democrats, Hiram Montserrat, Peter Spada, and Kruger.
And they were all
three
all
are now
serving
in the
federal
whole scandal.
sentences, right? So that's the type that's not the full quality of the opposition that you face, but there's real resistance. There's power, and there's the governor's power versus the MTA
What
and
the governor
mayor.
chooses to do, I do not know.
Right.
He will have that choice, and I suspect, I would hope very much, particularly after this fall's election, that the governor will support the incremental revenues necessary to fully fund the next 5-year plan.
Okay.
And I think if the governor supports it, it will happen.
What other incremental revenues are there out there that aren't being utilized now? You've got, the East River bridges being told. You've suggested congestion pricing in some form. What else?
Gas tax.
Raising the gas tax.
Raising the gas tax, right.
Okay, what else?
Well, they're raising automobile registration fees.
More dedicated streams that would go right directly into the authority. Does that add up to the amount of money, or do we need?
Oh, sure.
Or do we need more borrowing?
No. The revenue that would be created by tolls, taxes provides the means of servicing the debt.
Right.
If you buy a subway car, it has a useful life of 30 years, and therefore it's perfectly proper to amortize the cost of that over a 30-year period.
Right.
You need a revenue stream to service the debt.
And a dedicated revenue stream, because
you'll borrow more efficiently and more cheaply if the revenue is dedicated.
right, and also for good reason, because then the Pols can't fool around with it.
You got it.
Okay. Now, one of the things that the 2008 report suggested that really hasn't come to fruition is the expansion of bus lines, for example, into those areas that have been previously underdeveloped because, as you suggested, of population expansion. Whole areas of Queens are totally underserved by mass transit. Is there any thing on the horizon that would suggest that we're going to have really a comprehensive transportation plan? Or am I dreaming?
If there is, I'm not privy to it because I would only know if I read it in the paper or if some member of the MTA board would to tell me this in casual conversation. But I'm not aware of any further expansion plans. I can put it to you this way.
Go ahead.
I know that at a professional level, there has always been significant discussion about having another main line on the Long Island Railroad.
Mm-hmm.
That is opposed by a lot of Long Island politicians, but not by Long Island commuters.
Why are the politicians opposed?
Because it would tie up traffic in the towns that would be the recipient of the additional trackage.
Okay.
There is a serious need to connect Metro North to Penn Station, to provide rapid transit for Co-op City and what hopefully will be an expansion of more development in the East Bronx.
Uh-huh.
And God knows only when the 2nd Avenue subway is going to go up to the Bronx.
But I mean, your memory is longer than
not my
mine, but I mean,
lifetime.
I remember, I mean, it's going on since I was a kid, probably before I was a kid. And I haven't been a kid for a while. Is that ever going to get done? Ever? Be optimistic. You're an optimist.
I
Tell
am
me
an
yes.
optimist. Yes, I mean, but the real justification for the 2nd Avenue
Go.
subway was not to make life better for the people who live on the east side of Manhattan, although that was the driving force.
Right, right,
Got the 2nd Avenue subway.
right. You need constituents,
approved.
right.
And they were rich and powerful constituents. But the real justification for the 2nd Avenue subway was to open up the East Bronx for development.
Oh, the East Bronx. I didn't
Of
realize
course.
that.
That was the real motivation. But instead, they're building it down to the tip of Manhattan, which probably has more subway service per per acre than any part of the city. of
Another
New York.
Gold Coast phenomenon here?
Yes.
Yes? Okay. Fair policy. The controller recently, Tom DiNapoli recently discovered, what, $1.9 billion in the MTA, in the MTA revenue stream. And he and others suggested that the mandatory biennial fares be done away with or reduced. Your reaction to that?
I'm not familiar with that report.
Okay.
So I can't comment except to say that the biennial fare increases was a recommendation that I made
Right.
in our 2008 report, because I said instead of having a circus every time you have to have a fare,
Sure.
there should be an agreement that every 2 years, whatever the increase in cost and operating expenses of the system be, it ought to be reflected in a fare increase. And if the state wishes to provide additional subsidy to defray that increase, that's fine. But the MTA should be prepared to cover that inflationary cost and operating expenses out of fares. And the capital ought to be paid for out of tax revenues supported by the state.
Now, one of the things that has always struck me about the fares in New York, I mean, we always complain and gripe when there's, for $2.50, you could travel, what, 538 miles? I mean, if you go to London, everybody says, wow, London, or wow, Paris, or wow, Shanghai, or wow, this, or wow, that. If you go to London, for $2.50, you can't get to the next subway stop. So, I mean, there's a real comparative issue here, but the fares are like a third rail. I mean, there's lots of third rails. Is that impossible to maintain that over time?
First of all, everywhere else in the world, the creation of and maintenance of subway systems, be it London, Tokyo, Hong Kong, Paris, they're functions of the national government.
Right.
And they take that responsibility because they think, quite properly, that in the major cities, a functioning, safe, economically priced mass transit system is critical to the economy of their country. In this country, we have a battle to get a farthing out of the federal government for mass transit purposes. There have been moments in time when there's been generous contributions.
Right.
People, my Democratic friends, don't like to hear this, but the single largest injection of federal money to mass transit came through Ronald Reagan.
Interesting. And you were there when it happened.
I was there when it happened.
Okay. Governance. Just looking at the MTA, the way it's structured, if we could start all over and you were the architect, what's the structure? What's the decision-making process? Because obviously it's the process of decision-making that impacts on the substance of policy. How do you change the MTA? Make it something else.
I have to tell you, I'm a big believer in changing a lot of things about the way our governments work, but I think the structure of the MTA is sound, right on the mark.
Oh, good.
And
Interesting.
I think that the governor should have the power to appoint somebody for a fixed term of 6 years, and I think you have adequate regional representation. The question is whether the people appointed by the governor and the mayor and the county execs are going to be people who are going to act with a full understanding that their fiduciary responsibility runs to the purposes for which the MTA exists.
But the reality probably is that they're beholden to the desires of their patrons, which is two very different things. And you really can't get away
It's not
from that.
necessarily. It all depends on whether or not the patron, as you call him or her, what they view as their highest priority. If their highest priority is to keep fares down and they don't care whether 5 years later there's any new equipment rolling into the
Yeah, then we
MTA,
ended up in the situation that you walked into in
That's
the
correct.
80s, that, you know, it's totally, the infrastructure is allowed to deteriorate. Now, given where you're sitting right now and you're looking down the road, what do you see here with the transportation system in New York City? What do you, in 5 years, what does this all look like? Or what ought it look like?
Well, I'll tell you what my view is. I think if you look at the Census Bureau's projections, demographic projections for the United States, that you're going to see that most of the increase of 50 million people is going to occur in our major cities. I think New York City is the greatest city in the world. It's vibrant, it's exciting. People continue to come here, whether they're Russian billionaires or poor people off a boat from China or the Middle East, and because there's opportunity here. And so I believe the population's going to expand. And therefore, I think the public investment in the infrastructure that can guarantee that people can get to their place of employment
And back home, and back home.
to their ballparks, their movie theaters, their sources of entertainment, their schools, their colleges. That's a critical part of this. So I hope that the next generation of politicians are conscious of the fact that they're going to have to commit a very, very substantial piece of their resources and create new resources to make this investment. Because if we let the mass transit system slide, as politicians did in the 60s and early 70s, you're going to see an exodus from New York City.
If I were a younger, wise guy, my reaction to your optimism is, what are you smoking? And that is,
I quit 3 years ago.
Oh, no, not that, other kind of smoking. How does that sort of rational global view conflict with what you know is the short-term electoral interest and strategies of governors, speakers of the assembly, majority leaders of the Senate, assemblymen and senators? Am I too?
Doug, look,
Talk to me.
I don't know
Go ahead.
as many of the people of the younger generation in politics that I once did. But my sense is they are caring people. I think Bill de Blasio, and he doesn't have the economic means as mayor to do much about it himself, but I think he's going to come to understand that the city that he's responsible for governing is really dependent on a transportation system, and he's going to be a powerful advocate for that.
You think?
In the halls of Albany and the halls
You think
of
the city
Congress.
ups its contribution to the MTA, which it's really been cutting back?
No, because no, but I don't think that's the point. The point is
Go ahead.
that most of the help's got to come from both Washington and the state level.
Okay.
Second of all, the problem is that our business community recognized in the 80s the necessity of having a safe system. And when I went to Albany to get taxes enacted to provide revenues for the MTA, I never would have gotten it accomplished if it wasn't for the leadership of the business community.
Do you see that now?
David Rockefeller,
I'm sorry.
Dick
Go ahead.
Shin, Bill Ellinghouse, they went to Albany and they said to the Republicans in Albany, I don't know what their words were, but the essence of it was give Ravitch his tax package. And they did. Now, I do not know where the business leadership is today in terms of the advocacy of additional revenues to support the MTA, but that's critical.
Okay.
We need the business community. If the business community isn't broad-minded enough to recognize that, I feel sorry for them.
Nice ending. We're going to continue this conversation. I guess next time you want to talk Medicaid?
Sure.
Okay. My thanks to Richard Ravitch for helping us better understand problems and prospects for the MTA and therefore all New Yorkers. Join us next week when my guest will be James Parrott, Chief Economist and Deputy Director of the Fiscal Policy Institute here on CUNY TV. Thank you. Hello, I'm Doug Muzzio. Let us know what you think about this show. You can reach us at CUNY.TV. When you get there, click on the bar that says Contact Us and send your email. Whatever it is. Thanks, no thanks, obnoxious, do it. Send it.